Welcome. And I noticed as I was driving down that this is a cold winter's eve with a bright, bright, bright full moon and a little bit of magic, the magic of storytelling in the air out there. And I'm just I'm so incredibly grateful that we have the gift of Bill storytelling once again this year. Bill, I can't tell you the messages that come in. Well, I have told you, but the messages come in and people are so delighted to be able to attend and that you're doing this. So I'm gonna as you come in, try to mute yourself. So I'll go around and catch you if you don't. The story that Bill is about to relate this year to you is one of his own creations. You're not going to find it published anywhere. You won't find it online. You're not going to find a recording. This is a gift of the moment. But also, as Bill himself is, it's something of time immemorial. So Bill's craft, I'm not saying that you're the vieux immeuble, right? the old furniture, but Bill's craft is an old tradition. It's as old as gathering around the fireside or time spent on a cold winter's night. Sort of harkens back to an earlier time, but I think it still speaks to us of wonder and humanity that's vitally important. Because why would we all show up for something like this? Of course, it's also the magnetism of Bill's storytelling and charisma, but but it's also a wonderful gift of an older time and something that we still desperately need, I think. So thank you, Bill, for this amazing gift that you give us each. Thank all of you for your company and your community tonight.
Indeed.
I'm going to let in a few more folks who are waiting. Remind everybody to mute yourself and turn off your video if you could, so that we can all focus on Bill. And Bill, why don't you take it away?
Okay. Well, I join Michelle in welcoming everybody. It's always a real delight, wonderful treat to me to see people that often I haven't seen for months or even years that show up for this event. And I just love it. At any rate, this is one of the very first Christmas stories I ever wrote, now well over 20 years ago that I wrote this. And since I wrote it for the entertainment originally of the guests staying at the inn at Christmas time, it includes a lot about Grafton and is centered in Grafton. So they could actually identify certain features in the story about town. And so I made it about a character who focused his entire life in Grafton. And it's called Yoshu, Man of Grafton. And here we go. Even though cries of Merry Christmas, fill the air for the better part of a week as one after another of his children and their families arrived for the holiday, old Yoshu knew that this gathering of all his offspring was due to the certainty that he would not live for another year. He wasn't sick in body or feeble in mind, but Yoshu was, by far, the oldest man throughout the region. In fact, of all the travelers who passed through town, many from distant places, even foreign lands, no one could claim to have known anyone else to have reached the age of 116. This fact, while celebrated among the villagers, had recently been defined by Yoshu as old enough is old enough. He longed to see again his wife, now gone for over 30 years, and the 4 children he had outlived. But for the family and friends that surrounded him on a daily basis, the most convincing evidence of his impending end were the cracks that had begun to appear in the impenetrable wall of secrecy about his own origins and ancestry. These cracks were the surest sign of his great age, for they were not willful revelations, but moments when, dozing by the wood stove in his kitchen, he would murmur in a strange and musical tongue, or working concentratedly in his shop next door, he would hum snatches of tunes the like of which no one had ever heard before. Questions resulted, of course, but Yoshu brushed them aside as easily and amiably as he had all his life. No one took offense, and no one received so much as a smidgen of insight. Yoshu's house filled to overflowing, and arrangements had to be made to lodge many of the grandchildren and their children in other homes throughout the town. But Grafton was a small town, and no house in the village center was very far from any other. Besides, the story fostered by Yoshu that he had had no existence before coming to Grafton was repeated so many times down all the years of his happy life that the residents of town considered themselves to be part of his extended family. For him, Grafton was his beginning and his end. It had provided home, livelihood, wife, and family. It was the sum of all he was, and that was just the way he wanted it. By trade, Yoshu was a fiddle maker, and though after his 100th birthday, production fell off to only 4 instruments per year, the sums paid for these few, were such an amount that it afforded him a comfortable life. In addition to making fiddles, he was unchallenged in his expertise on local wood, and he made a secondary business out of selecting, curing, and reselling the finest figured maple, cherry, oak, beech, ash, and spruce. When times were very lean, he was known to work as a cabinet maker, at one point constructing a grandfather clock, all but the mainspring of which was made of wood. This clock had been commissioned by the wealthy owner of the local soapstone quarry, who, after selling his business, moved his family and the clock to Boston. This resulted in many years of inquiries by other wealthy Bostonians, whose petitions, accompanied by promises of astronomical sums, were politely refused. One Boston banker even made a trip to Grafton in person to plead his case, and having no success, managed to buy away from one family a beautifully carved hope chest, which Yoshu had presented to them for the marriage of their only daughter. In that the daughter had left town suddenly with a leather goods salesman before she ever got married, the couple felt vaguely justified in accepting the $500 offered to them by the determined man. Yoshu never said a word about this to the couple, but most townspeople considered it a breach of faith, and it was only years later, when Yoshu himself hosted a village party to honor their 50th wedding anniversary, that the couple was forgiven by the general population. But of all that endeared him to the town he loved so much, first and foremost was Yoshu's fiddle playing. No wedding, funeral, or square dance could be considered complete without him, for in his music, he gave voice to the heart of his people. Feet would fly to his pulsing bow and the laughter of his eyes. Each bride and groom that sealed their troth to his wedding tune would feel such a wellspring of love as would last all their lives. And as for final closure, it was said that if Yoshu played for the death of a dog that had bitten every leg in Grafton, folks would grieve as though they'd lost their next of kin. Many years had passed since the last person who could remember Yoshu's arrival in the village had died. Yet the fact that he had come with bears was still discussed. One day, late in spring, he had walked into town from the west with a staff in one hand, a sack across his shoulder, and in the other hand a rope leash to which was attached his 4 bears. Every child, dog, and adult he had passed over the last several miles followed at a respectful distance. And the progress was slow, the foraging pace of a bear. The animals fed constantly on grubs, worms, roots, rodents, and insects as they moved along, and the soothing drone of Yoshu's chatter was barely audible to the closest of the curious crowd. As this extraordinary parade proceeded down the main street of Grafton, it was clear that their coming had been announced. Not a horse was to be seen, not an idle citizen. Adults and children peered from windows, and here and there, menacingly, a gun. Having nearly reached the village store, the bears were startled by a small child who had been overlooked while playing in some sequestered spot, and who now tried to bolt past the animals to reach home and safety. With only a few feet to spare between itself and the bears, the child lost its nerve, panicked, and froze in terror before the great black forms. Quietly, Yoshu raised his hand, and quietly he lowered it. Immediately the bears sat down. He then dropped the leash, picked up the child, and carried it to the waiting arms of its mother. This astonished the onlookers, but it did not reassure them. Yoshu was accustomed to this, so he picked up the leash and headed out of the village southward down the Townsend Road. But something had happened to Yoshu, something for which he had been waiting over many miles, days, months, and even years. In the sudden and complete awareness, he knew that he had found his place, or it had found him, and it was Grafton, Vermont, that would see the rest of his life played out. Later that day, word spread through town that Yoshu was back without the bears. After an impressive demonstration of ability, he had been hired to join the newly formed crew building an addition onto the hotel called the Tavern. By the day's end, whispers about the stranger reached a fevered pitch when the farmer from 3 miles south on the Townsend Road began showing to everyone a large solid gold coin which Yoshu had given him as a year's rent. This paid for a room, 1 meal a day, and a spacious shed for the housing of the bears. Whispers were again raised when, in the heat of the afternoon's labor, Yoshu followed the example of his crewmates and shed his shirt. Matching his shock of jet black hair and short, thick beard was a light blanket of hair covering his arms, chest, and back. The physical similarity between him and his pets was obvious, and at a time when bears were considered dangerous and thus shot as often as possible, unfriendly feelings could have been expected. Any suspicious thoughts were distracted, however, by the hypnotic beauty of the gold chain and cross that hung from his neck. The gold itself was uncommonly red, and the workmanship of the highest quality. 4 perfectly cut rubies had been set in the extremities of the cross, and at the center, in what appeared to be a clover, were a diamond, an emerald, and a sapphire. However, it was not this casual display of wealth that his fellow workers found so compelling, but Yoshu's complete and natural comfort in their company that put them at their ease. This might not be expected from a man who lived day to day with bears, yet truth be known, Yoshu had wandered the earth for many years waiting to find his place of predilection, the place where in his heart he knew he was destined to be. It was this certainty and this contentment which filled him to overflowing and spread like enchantment to those around him. Yet many questions about from where and why he had come to Grafton would have required answers had Yoshu known more than just a few words of English. As it was, this limitation, which would have been an obstacle to most men, served him well, allowing him to communicate through the ingenuity and goodwill that characterized his basic nature. It was not long, however, before the opportunity to learn grammar and vocabulary presented themselves to him. For at the end of a day, several of the workmen's wives and children arrived at the site with jugs of cool switchel and freshly baked cookies. Among this group was Clara Miller, the foreman's daughter. While only 16, she was generally thought to be the best educated person in the area, and possessed of such clear purpose and strong mind that she had been made mistress of the central school in the village. The men clothed themselves immediately upon seeing the approach of their families. Yoshu had donned his shirt discreetly behind a stack of lumber. Understanding the more intricate social network that had just unfolded, he was in the process of slipping away along the rear of the tavern when he felt a sudden tug at his sleeve. He jumped a bit in surprise and turned to face a young woman who, for the blessing of youth and the confidence of her bearing, could be considered pretty. Like him, she was dark-haired and strong of limb, but with startlingly blue eyes. "Sir, would you like something to drink?" Yoshu did not reply with words. Instead, he bowed from the waist with the gracious, easy gesture of a courtier who has executed this movement hundreds of times before. He studied her eyes carefully as he took the jug from her hand, then raised it to his mouth and drained the contents completely in one long pull. The young lady was too intrigued to be shocked, and as he handed her the empty jug, he bowed once again. As though some force within this gesture demanded a response, she copied it exactly. But as she righted herself, he slipped the golden chain from over his head and placed it over hers. There was no moment to recover, to speak, to refuse. She held the cross in the palm of her hand, utterly transfixed by a thing that so far exceeded her wildest imaginings. When she raised her eyes, Yoshu had gone. But Clara Miller was waiting at the roadside some distance outside the town when Yoshu came to work the following day. Her father, the foreman, stood by her. As he approached, Yoshu smiled and raised his hand in greeting. The foreman did not smile, but he extended his own hand and the two men shook in a firm, formal manner. Knowing what was to transpire, Yoshu turned to Clara and made his gracious, easy bow, pausing just long enough at the lowest point to allow her to place the treasure once again over his head. Then, for just a second, he held the cross over his heart before tucking it under the collar of his shirt. As with all things regarding Yoshu, the ease and clarity of his behavior dispelled any embarrassment and made even the newest acquaintances feel a comfort normally reserved for family and friends. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you," he repeated slowly, and they walked back to town together to begin the day's work. Life with bears inspired gossip, and at the village store, daily visits by the farmer who was Yoshu's landlord were eagerly awaited. In particular, the farmer's children enjoyed unprecedented celebrity, and no matter how wild their tales became, no one scoffed at them or failed to repeat what they had heard. The most imaginative youngster assured all listeners that Yoshu was indeed a sorcerer who used his magic to transform his enemies into bears, condemned to serve him for the rest of their lives. Despite the pleasure such stories brought to daily life in Grafton, the truth was clear to all. Yoshu was a well-disciplined, hard-working man who had no enemies. True, it was unheard of to live with bears, but the regularity of his long walks with them, generally just before dawn and just after sunset, fell into an easy rhythm that folks came to accept, just as they were happy to accept a share in trove after trove of honey discovered by this peculiar fellowship. The only real magic regarding Yoshu was the rapid progress on the tavern annex since he had joined the construction crew. He did not work faster or harder than any of the other men, but despite his language deficiency, He contrived ingenious and immediate solutions to the problems that are always part of any such project. On one occasion, Yoshu was busy marking timbers and cutting mortises for the main supports when he became aware of a nearby debate that soon engaged the attention of everyone. The ground sloped upwards for the length of the inn and over the last half of the addition. Where the slope increased most noticeably, bedrock had been struck, thus preventing the joists from clearing the ground sufficiently to guard against moisture and rot. It was the opinion of most that the rock should be drilled and blasted, a lengthy undertaking that would delay the project and increase the expense. The innkeeper, a well-liked but frugal man, Mr. Enos Lovell, wrung his hands and pulled at his whiskers. Quietly, Yoshu motioned Foreman Miller to one side, and taking a stick, made a quick, simple, clear drawing in the dirt. Foreman Miller summoned Mr. Lovell and showed him the drawing, depicting Yoshu's proposal that instead of correcting the granite obstacle they now faced, the addition be constructed at a slightly higher level than the main inn, then joining the two by a step. After a few minutes of thought that left him nearly whiskerless, Mr. Lovell shook Foreman Miller's hand, clapped him on the back, and the work proceeded. When Foreman Miller turned to speak to Yoshu, he saw that he was again hard at work on mortises, so he let the issue drop. Among the men, the differences in elevation between the old building and the new, still being traversed today by guests of the inn, was named Yoshu's Step. Not but a couple of weeks following this occurrence, another noteworthy problem arose. A large horizontal support beam had arrived from the mill, and an eager crew member had cut a joint at one end before the other had been checked. At the end yet to be cut, a nasty irregular knot was found that thwarted any hope of making a proper joint. Head scratching and frustration followed, and it seemed that the beam would have to be recut to serve some other purpose. Yoshu, however, walked over to the shade tree where the men stashed their lunches and withdrew from his satchel a notebook and pencils such as used by the children at the local school. Returning to the beam, he set the notebook down and in quick, simple lines drew an irregular joint that skirted the problem knot and promised to be just as secure, if not more so, than the original. Admired as this improvisation was, the writing on the facing page of the notebook was what truly fascinated the other men. In neatly printed letters stood column after column of words. Each column repeated the same words some 20 times, copying perfectly the model, which stood at the top in Clara Miller's impeccable hand. There was some cautious laughter among the men. Someone put his hand on Yoshu's shoulder. It was Foreman Miller, whose eyes were trained on the notebook. He reached out with his other hand so that 3 of his fingers rested on the written exercises, but his index finger extended over to the page with the drawing. Not raising his eyes from the book, he said slowly, "Good, Yoshu, good." Yoshu looked at Mr. Miller, held out his hand, and as they shook, Yoshu smiled and said with no trace of an accent, "This is very good." When Christmas of that year arrived, Yoshu spoke in clear, simple sentences. It was a style he maintained for the rest of his life, and it suited the townsfolk of Grafton just fine. Certainly there was no ambiguity in his speech when, at a square dance held in the newly completed annex to the tavern, Yoshu stood in a line of men opposite their partners. Of course, he was facing Clara Miller. Suddenly, he alone stepped forward. Before Clara realized that such a move was not being called, she too stepped forward. the music faltered and the two were left alone in sudden silence. Yoshu executed his slow and gracious bow. So compelling was this gesture that many felt their bodies tilting forward in response, and Clara, whom Yoshu kept fixed in his gaze, curtsied deeply. Then, for the last time in her life, Clara felt the golden chain passed over her head. The blood rushed to her face, and in a sort of dizzy trance, she heard Yoshu's voice. She had given him words, how to spell them, how to say them, and what they meant. And now her star pupil performed impeccably. Clara Miller, will you be my wife? Clara was going to say yes. She wanted to say yes and thought she had, but the sudden whoops and thunderous applause drowned out all other sound for many seconds. Yoshu stepped back in line, so did Clara, and when the caller shouted out, "We'll now dance, Birdie in a cage," the laughter and merriment fairly lifted the dancers off the floor. During that first winter, when the overall pace of life slowed and the weather grew more severe, Yoshu rented 2 small rooms above the village store, equipped them with a wood stove, a table, a stool, and some chests, and hung his sign as a fiddle maker. This caused some buzz in town. Many questions were asked and then answered by the very people asking them according to their fancy, but those bold enough to ask Yoshu directly about where he had learned this trade found him friendly, even jocular, but suddenly so diminished in language skills as to leave them smiling and struggling in resignation. Then there were numerous trips to Frank Farnsworth's blacksmith shop, where the 2 men would spend hours drawing and discussing the tools Yoshu needed before actually making them. It was rumored that Frank was more an apprentice than a master in this relationship, but Yoshu gave him all the credit, and he was well paid besides. There were also trips to several of Grafton's sawmills, where Yoshu made odd selections, sometimes choosing wood that had been scorched by fire, but was otherwise undamaged, or old beaten planks from some of the earliest buildings in town that had been taken down and replaced with new ones. But once his shop was assembled, Yoshu virtually disappeared from sight. Only the smoke from his stovepipe and the light in his windows that burned late into the night attested to how hard he was working. It was late March when musical sounds could be heard coming from the shop. At first, they were just long, drawn-out tones, then tuning, then more tones of all pitches, high and low. This continued for days, causing people to pause in the street, make comments or jokes, and then move on. Finally, one sun-filled morning, the full magic of Yoshu's art was revealed. Even though the shop windows were all closed tight, the sound of a fiddle rang out rich and clear. One after another, the classic dance tunes were played with such vigor that it was not long before a crowd of villagers gathered in the street and began to dance. In their heavy coats, boots, mufflers, and mittens, the dancers made a merry and comic spectacle. And when the music ended, Yoshu threw open the window and invited everyone to come in and see what he had made. With only 2 rooms, barely large enough to admit 6 people at a time, the line was long and the viewing slow. But consensus was it was worth it. Word spread, and 3 hours later, when no one was left waiting, just about every man, woman, and child in town had passed through the shop. The fiddles were a matched pair, each with a back and sides of richly figured honey-colored curly maple, fingerboard and tailpiece of hophorn beam, stained with iodine to achieve a deep, rusty red, and elegantly carved tuning pegs of black cherry. Most compelling and a bit whimsical were the scrolls, which, although classical in their general form, were unmistakably stylized beech leaves. One of the two fiddles Yoshu kept for himself. The other was tucked safely in its case when he set out for Boston 2 days later. This was the one and only trip to Boston, or anywhere outside the immediate region for that matter, that Yoshu ever had to make. In Boston, it was spring already. It was making swift headway, and for 3 consecutive days, starting around mid-morning, Yoshu stood on the commons and played his fiddle. At first, a small crowd would gather. As the crowd grew, Yoshu played ever more complex and delightful variations on the best-known tunes. And when he judged the crowd to be at its largest, he would pause to rest. Then inquiries began. Offers were made. Serious bidders were granted the privilege of testing the instrument. And on the 3rd day, Yoshu hit his target price of $300. Just as important as this kingly sum was the fact that his pockets, which had been stuffed with neatly cut pieces of paper bearing his name and address, were completely empty. Within 2 weeks of his having returned to Grafton, it was never known that he left again, orders for instruments began to arrive, and with a special price offered to customers who picked up their instruments in person, the world came to Yoshu, and he stayed home. The cubs that were born that winter were the first of many down the years, and Yoshu rarely kept the offspring beyond the age at which they could survive on their own. Yet for generation after generation, he found himself incapable of giving up completely his beloved pets. Keeping bears meant long daily walks to accommodate their foraging, and when in good weather, he left his house with a rucksack holding lunch and his fiddle case, it was certain that he and the bears would not return much before dark. Clara joined Yoshu as often as she could in these perambulations, though less and less after their children began to arrive, and so far as anyone knew, only Clara was ever privileged to go with them. Every now and then, on clear, warm days, villagers would hear snatches of music drifting down from the distance of Bear Hill, a hill which got the name it has to this very day for being the favorite foraging site of the bears. Long after Yoshu had moved into a spacious house on Main Street just across from the inn, he continued to house his bears at the farm on Townsend Road, until, at last, he had only one great black male surviving. This bear he doted on, and folks had so accustomed themselves to the presence of these animals that there was not a single voice raised in protest when he moved it into a spacious pen behind his house. That bear would have faded quietly away like the others, had it not been for an incident at Grafton's big soapstone quarry in the spring of 1872. One perfectly pleasant day, a dull clanging rang out over the town that called every able-bodied soul up Kidder Hill on a dead run. It was the alarm gong sounding, and it was used only in the most dire circumstances. The scene at the quarry was one of pain and panic. The men had been using the pithocks to move a tremendous block of stone away from the wall of which it had been part, when an unnoticed flaw near the base had caused the piece to suddenly shear off, toppling the stone onto 2 of the workers. Had it not been for several large scraps of rock lying about, which kept the big block from meeting the ground flush, the men would have died instantly. The ox, in its fright, had lurched sideways, stepped in a crack, and broken its leg, and its pained bellowing echoed throughout the pit, voicing perfectly the horror of the circumstances. Several men had seized small timbers and were vainly attempting to lever the stone off their fellow workers. Yoshu was among the first villagers to arrive, and after surveying the scene for only a moment, he turned and ran madly for home. He had barely reached the foot of the hill when a shot rang out and the bellowing stopped. Just 30 minutes later, he was back, and with him, he had a pulling collar, some heavy harness, and his last bear, whose hackles lurched menacingly to and fro from atop the small hillock of muscle between his shoulders. The men drew back. On Yoshu's command, 2 large chisels were quickly driven deeply into the top of the block, and along the far edge, substantial stones were piled up to act as fulcrums for the timbers. Mumbling almost inaudibly to the bear in a sort of droning chant, Yoshu simultaneously stroked its head and ears as he slipped the pulling collar over the broad face. The harness was fastened to on one end to the heavy brass rings of the collar, and on the other to the chisels. The men were positioned and ready, 3 each, manning 2 large timbers. After leading the bear forward so the harness was taut, Yoshu let him feel for a few seconds the weight of this great stone, and the breathing of the bear became heavy, aggressive, and in perfect sync with the rhythm of Yoshu's voice. He placed one hand on the bear's head. The murmuring waxed in tempo and volume, and the breathing of the bear was like a rushing wind. Every breath seemed to expand his body, and the heavy black claws flexed deep into the soapstone floor. Without looking up, Yoshu raised his free hand, and when it seemed his rapidly waxing voice would break with such a fierce, raw wailing, he simultaneously thrust down his hand and cried out one abrupt command. Whatever this word meant, or from wherever it might have come, the bear threw himself against the weight of the rock, and the men bore down full strength upon their levers. To the distinct sound of stone crushing stone, the slab slowly raised upwards. The bear's breath came in short, hard bursts, his body hugging the ground, into which his claws dug deeper and deeper. Only a couple of degrees from the balance point, the forward motion of the stone stopped. The levers had exhausted their advantage, and they could help no more. With both hands, Yoshu seized the bear by the hackles, and in unison, the 2 roared so primal, so desperate a cry as to defy description. As the slab toppled forward, so did the bear and Yoshu beside him, his fists still entwined in the coarse fur. As though the effort had propelled them into another world altogether, Yoshu knelt and cradled the beast's big head in his lap, oblivious to all else. The bear was dead. And for the only time anyone could ever recall, tears poured down Yoshu's otherwise tranquil face, yet he made no sound. His eyes became distant, turning soft and gray like the stone all about him, and there was a distinct sense that Yoshu too had stopped breathing, that the spirit of the man and the bear had become one, moving through the passage between this world and the next. It was then that Yoshu felt it, a certain weight and heat upon his shoulder, a slowly growing pressure drawing him back, parting him gently but firmly from the bear in his soul and keeping him here in the world of men. Slowly he turned towards the hand on his shoulder, studying it as though from a distance. This hand, huge, black, with great thick fingers, pulsing slowly, waking him, infusing him with life. When, finally, he raised his eyes to look into the face of Alec Turner, each man knew without a word that destiny had brought them here together and that their friendship would outlast their mortal lives. Alec Turner had arrived in Grafton that very day. Born into slavery, he escaped his owner during the Civil War and fought for his freedom as a soldier in the Union Army. In the aftermath of the war and the anxiety that followed the murder of President Lincoln, Alec and his wife Sally began a search through the uncertainties of a free life. Free without family, free without work, free without a place to call home. But Alec Turner possessed two gifts that assured his success. He had the gift of a truly noble soul, and he had his prodigious body. Wandering from Washington northwards into Maine and then back to Boston, it was there that Alec first learned of Grafton, Vermont. Grafton needed loggers, and the only requirements were physical strength and the will to work. As the buckboard wagon carrying Alec and Sally pulled up in front of the village store, they were astonished to see Yoshu, a pulling collar in one hand and a rope leash in the other attached to a large bear, rushing past them down the street. The town was virtually empty, and had it not been for one old-timer left sitting on the steps of the store to inform them of the crisis at the quarry, they might have assumed that black settlers in Grafton had precipitated its desertion. As it was, with considerable experience working in the slate quarries of Maine, Alec figured he might be of some use, and so headed off quickly in the direction his informer had given him. He arrived in time to be of more use than he might have imagined, for it was not his physical strength that was Yoshu's salvation, but that intuitive compassion, crowned by an abiding faith in life, that led him to plunge unhesitatingly into those realms where only souls can journey, then take Yoshu in his bewilderment and despair, and lead him back to the land of living men. The bond formed at that moment between the two was as deep as that which ever existed between brothers, and from then on, their friendship was legendary. For most folks, the thought of Grafton and Yoshu had become by this time inseparable. Yoshu was the embodiment of all that the community was and aspired to, and when he warmly embraced the Turners, so did the town. Help came to them from many hands, and a whole new chapter in village history began. Down the years, there were many stories surrounding Yoshu and Alec, but one of the most beloved was the simple account of Turner's first social outing. It was not but a few weeks after the fateful meeting at the quarry that the first square dance of the summer was held, and upon that occasion, Grafton became aware of the musical talent of the Turners. Everyone was there, it seemed, and the atmosphere was exuberant. A couple of hours into the evening, the band and the dancers took a break, whereupon Alec went up and spoke to Yoshu. After a moment of conversation, Yoshu remounted the small stage and announced to everyone that Grafton's newest residents, Alec and Sally Turner, as well as Sally's brother, William Early, who arrived only 2 days before to help with the homesteading, would entertain them with a few tunes from the South. Sally was given a guitar, Uncle Early, as William was called, asked to borrow a banjo, and Alec was immediately possessed of Yoshu's fiddle. The crowd grew quiet. I would apologize for that we do not have presently any instruments of our own, and so may find ourselves a bit rusty, announced Alec. And with that, Sally began tapping her feet and strumming, soon joined by Uncle Early. Once the rhythm section was well established, Alec made his entrance, and while it was clear that he was not in top form, the natural warmth and superb resonance of the fiddle encouraged him to do his best. Certainly the visual spectacle of Alec playing, his huge hands dwarfing the instrument, the massive shoulder of his right arm pulsing as he worked the bow, was entertainment enough for his audience, and more than compensated for any missing notes or roughness in his tone. In only a few minutes, the entire gathering was drawn once again to dance, and only Yoshu stood off to the side, his eyes glowing and intense, as though listening to some story in the music that the dancers couldn't hear. The first dance was rather a long one, and after some time, Alex suddenly caught Yoshu's gaze. Whatever communication took place, Alex slowly closed his eyes, almost as though he were falling asleep, and with no break in the tempo, the music modulated from major to minor. Instantly, the dance was transformed. The crowd came to a standstill, and the talk and laughter died. Everyone was now listening the way Yoshu was listening. And with only a fiddle and all of his soul, Alec Turner began to tell the tale of his family, his people, the land of his ancestors, their enslavement and heartbreak, and the horror of the Great War which had just been fought to right so great a wrong. Grafton's cemeteries bore their share of recent graves and grief from the Civil War. And the people listened to this tale as though they themselves were telling it. This was a tale that was their tale too, a story of the human heart, its good and its bad, its grief and its joy. The fiddle sighed and moaned. It raised fresh, strong melodies tinged with sadness and yearning for things that would never again be known. And hope was there, returning time and again like the memory of a summer afternoon. Joy and nostalgia mixing in so sweet a sadness that one could have dwelt there forever. It was then that Yoshu began to dance. It was nothing like the dances Grafton people knew. A slow, shuffling step and a bowing, turning motion that was at once both clumsy and graceful. Back and forth he went, dancing alone, or with partners no one else could see, in a way that complemented the music and mesmerized the crowd, so that, as he steadily slowed his movements, the music slowed in perfect accompaniment, and the tale finally found its end. What the Turners shared that night meant that they had found their home in Grafton, and said so publicly in the music of their hearts. Grafton in turn accepted them and wove them into the fabric of its history. A few months after that event, just before Christmas, Yoshu met Alec as he arrived at the village store to buy provisions, and invited him into his shop for a cup of coffee. Once there, Yoshu set a simple, beautifully crafted box in front of his friend. For a minute, Alec looked in silence at the box, his head down, his eyes never moving, as though he could see through the wood to what the box contained. His index finger reached out and touched the letters A.T. carved in the lid, and seemingly incapable of doing more, Yoshu himself undid the hasp and opened the box. The incomparable aroma of beeswax and varnish filled the room, and there, nestled in a bed of padded velvet, was a fiddle. As beautiful as any he had ever made, this one was unique. In place of his trademark beech leaf scroll at the top of the neck, Yoshu had carved in perfect detail the head of a black bear. In the face was captured the humility, power, and intensity of the animals Yoshu loved so well, the same expression he loved in the face of his friend. For the rest of his days, Alec Turner played that fiddle, most often with Yoshu, so that down the years they developed together a style unlike any other that became known throughout the region as the Grafton School. There were many, many adventures to tell of, leading back to the night with which this account began. And because time is a constant constraint we cannot ignore, I'll have to put aside those other tales to focus on that Christmas Eve in 1910, when Yoshu's large devoted family had returned to Grafton to celebrate the long and happy life of their patriarch. Certainly there was no house in Grafton big enough to hold them all, and so for their grand family meal, they had rented the chapel, a building at the far end of Main Street, used to this day for church suppers and other large-scale gatherings. The chapel is a practical space with a large kitchen opening directly onto the dining area, where in winter a Franklin stove cast its welcome heat to the several large harvest tables surrounding it. It had taken days to prepare so great a feast, and in the back of the room a towering Christmas tree had been put up and decorated with traditional trimmings, long ropes of cranberries and popcorn, pomander balls, apples, painted walnuts, and frosted gingerbread men hung aplenty. Holiday candles shimmered everywhere, and attuned perfectly to the mood of the event, Yoshu was in high spirits. Rather than exhausting him, the animated crowd, the bustle, the clamor of many great-grandchildren seemed to infuse him with unusual energy. At the end of a long and merry meal, when the washing up was done and everyone was settling in and wondering what else might take place, Yoshu sent a few of his grandchildren down the street to collect 3 things with which the evening would be properly concluded. When the runners returned, a burst of applause greeted a keg of Yoshu's famous apple brandy, his very familiar violin case, and, well, what was it? That strange, rather battered old box. Yoshu just set it aside, jumped to his feet, and shouted, "First things first!" And with that, he deftly pulled the bung, drove home the tap, and drew the first glass of brandy. He swished it, smelled it, and studied it in the light of a nearby candle, all with the best melodramatic effect. Then he raised the glass to his lips, tipped it slightly, closed his eyes, and held that pose for just a second until the room was silent. In a quick motion, he then drained the entire glass in one pull, banged it down on the table, and emitted a long, hair-raising whoop that won shrieks from the children and applause from the approving adults. Yoshu seemed to be on fire. While a line formed in front of the brandy barrel and hot spiced cider was served to the children, Yoshu got out his fiddle and began a sprightly tune. "Dance, dance," he shouted. "Push back those tables, everybody up." The older family members had to give quick instruction to many of the youngest, but soon a rough sort of pattern was formed and the entire room was set in motion to the pulsing of the fiddle. Everyone was lost in the joy of the dance, but Yoshu's eyes never rested. Person by person, he studied the room, lovingly regarding every face, and over and again, his gaze settled on little Clara. Named for her great-grandmother, Clara couldn't dance. A fall from an apple tree and a badly set broken leg had deprived her of the agility required for dancing. But she watched the others. Her face was bright, her lips moved with the words of some secret song, and her body was consumed by the rhythm of the music. It was a long dance, and when it was over, Yoshu waited for silence. When all was quiet, he raised his arms as in a blessing. "My dear, dear family, all of you know what a long and wonderful life I have had, but soon it will be time for me to see my wife once again, and I look forward to that very much. My life has been so good that I will be able to leave each of you some token of my love. But the one possession dearest to me is my fiddle. It has been my voice for joy and for grief. It has been a bridge that has let me walk into the hearts of my fellow men and let theirs walk into mine. And now I must pass it on so that one of you may keep the key to the magical kingdom of music." As Yoshu spoke, he picked up his fiddle and bow and walked among his seated family. No one so much as stirred or coughed. He was passing behind little Clara's chair when he paused, reached out his hand, and rested it gently on her head. He then stepped around in front of her and knelt down so as to look directly into her eyes. "Dear child, you who bear the name of your great-grandmother with such grace and joy, it is to you that I give this instrument of limitless dreams. The wood, the glue, the strings are yours, and the dreams it has held can only stay with me, but you will fill this fiddle with dreams of your own and the dreams of those who listen to your playing with pleasure and love. I see the gift of music in your heart. Live long, my dear, and serve it well." When the wave of applause subsided, Clara, her hand on Yoshu's cheek, looked at him with concern. "But, great-grandfather, you must not give this to me now. What will you play?" Kissing her first on one cheek, then on the other, Yoshu answered, "I will show you, my dear. I will show you." He walked back to the table and, with tender reverence, took the battered old box that had been set aside, opened it, lifted out a bundle, and unwrapped several layers of soft cloth. Removal of the final layer exposed a simple wooden violin case with a rich patina, but otherwise unornamented. The room had grown as silent as though the holiest of church services was taking place. Yoshu unfastened the hasp, then paused to draw himself a measure of brandy. With one hand resting on the case and the other holding the glass of brandy upwards and outwards, as though offering it to someone, he closed his eyes and took a long breath. Then Yoshu spoke. His voice was rich and passionate and resonated with a power none of his family had ever heard before. And the words, waves of sound, incomprehensible yet hypnotic, as though all the names of everyone present were floating on a river of names that stretched from the beginning of time to the present and beyond. And suddenly, with no break in its melody, the language he spoke was again their own. "Father, beloved of your people, king of all Roma west of the Volga, master of bears and the fiddle that moves them, hear now your youngest son, Yoshu. He to whom you granted the freedom to roam, to seek his own path. He to whom you gave the best bears of your line. I invoke you, my father, to witness here the fruit of your blood and give us your blessing for the first time and the last time here in this place that I love. I will sound your great voice that your children may hear you and know evermore with reverence and honor your name, Bogdan, master of bears." In one easy motion, Yoshu drained his glass, opened the lid of the case, and lifted to his chin a fiddle black with age. It was undistinguished except for an ivory tailpiece, and at the top of the neck, a bear's head, exactly like the one Yoshu had carved on Alec Turner's fiddle. He brushed his finger over the strings and adjusted the tuning. In the utter silence of the room, these sounds, though faint, lingered and grew in the minds of the listeners. It was like a breeze stirring spruce trees in forests long ago forgotten, like water dripping into pools in the secret heart of a mountain, like the voices of bees drunk with nectar and perfume in a field of everlasting flowers. And here, this old man, this white-haired enchanter, whose back was still true and whose eyes burned with passion, picked up his bow and with a downstroke that sent a shudder through the building itself, intoned the voice of his father and his father's father back through a history so long it had forgotten its names, its dates, its joys and sadness. But it never had forgotten its song. And what a song it was! The voice of Bogdan was the voice of a people who had lived under themselves without house or land or the noble ambitions that drive men's lives. They lived like dust on the wind, drifting from place to place, a people unto themselves and their bears. Always the bears. What the world saw when the bears of the Roma danced was just a glimpse of a relationship so ancient and profound it defied description. But its mystery was nothing to compare to that which Bogdan had faced in trying to understand his youngest son, Yoshu. On the one hand, Yoshu was the most gifted master of bears the Roma had ever known. And on the other, though born a Roma, he had no lust to wander. He did not have a roamer's heart. And so it was that Yoshu's longest journey was his quest for a place to bury forever his Roma blood and put down roots so deep that he would never wander again. So completely had he succeeded in this that his family could never have imagined what was now transpiring before them. Their father, grandfather, and great-grandfather was first and foremost Yoshu, man of Grafton. It would have been easy to forget that, however, if you had suddenly been transported there on that Christmas Eve, watching him, empowered by a music and an instrument of such ancient lineage. As he played, he did not simply move across the chapel floor. The melody, so wild and compelling in its beauty, became ever richer and deeper, and Yoshu adopted the same dance-like movements he had displayed the night of the Turners' introduction to Grafton. When he reached the far side of the room, the door swung open into the night as though it were the most natural thing in the world, and Yoshu passed out into the moonlit street. There was a rush of family members grabbing for their coats and hats, bundling up children and crowding to get outside. No one considered calling Yoshu or stopping him. There was a collective sense that an act of enormous power was unfolding. And indeed, when the family regrouped, Yoshu had already passed his own house and the inn, and was now a distant silhouette in the middle of the street. Yet music filled the night, rising to the stars, bouncing off the hillsides and the doors and windows of the houses. Lights were appearing everywhere. "It's Yoshu! He must be drunk! He's crazy! Listen to that music! What's going on?" Soon the street was lined with curious folk, and by this time Yoshu had nearly reached the bridge. A couple of men had started down the street to get the old fellow and bring him home, but suddenly they froze in their tracks. In the brilliant moonlight, it was clear to see several large black shapes approaching from Kidder Hill Road, and then more from Chester Hill and up Pickle Street. It was too late to do anything. The bears had Yoshu surrounded until he was almost hidden from view, but the music continued unbroken. The bears were not moving, nor was Yoshu. He stood stock still, bow arm pumping, the melody floating on a drone that pulsed steady as a clock. Slowly, hypnotically, the bears began to sway in time to the beat. It was then that Yoshu executed his deep and elegant bow. The bears rose on their hind legs, paws raised in front, and bowed in reply. No one on the street moved a muscle. Yoshu raised his right foot and set it down, then his left. The bears moved in unison with him. Slowly he turned, and the bears did the same. And thus, step by step, it happened. There in the heart of Grafton, Yoshu's last dance. Beneath the moonlit sky, his cotton white hair as bright as though he were himself a star, and all about him a throng of shadows moving as he moved. They breathed as he breathed and accepted the gift he so readily gave them until the spark was spent and could no longer sustain his body. When the music suddenly faltered, the bears went down on all fours. Yoshu stopped moving and lowered himself slowly to his knees. The tune wandered off, its pulse broken. The bears acted like giant, sleepy children, confused to find themselves awake and unsure of where they were. When Yoshu fell forward, there was a sharp cracking sound as the instrument broke beneath his body. In an instant, the bears were gone, off into the night as though they never had been. And there lay old Yoshu. When the first of his family reached him, he was laughing softly to himself, and he muttered over and again, "Oh, what a Christmas! What a beautiful, beautiful Christmas!" Yes, Yoshu died that very night, and while there were many tears shed, there was at the same time a sense of magic and wonder so strong that a more fitting end could not have been imagined. The funeral took place in the White Church on Christmas Day, and after the memories had been recounted, the songs sung with joy and nostalgia in equal measure, and the final benediction of the minister, who wished everyone a blessed and thoughtful Christmas. Suddenly, from a hidden corner behind the organ, there came a little tune. It was a simple tune of only 4 or 5 notes, but with a straightforward, pulsing rhythm that fixed everyone in place as a vision of the night before was resurrected. When the tune stopped, little Clara stepped into view, and before anyone so much as moved, she kissed her fiddle and tenderly put it away. And that, my friends, is the end of the story. I hope you enjoyed it. I always enjoy it. It's good fun. And Grafton is a magic place, as we all know. And gosh, it's such a privilege to live here. Such a privilege to have people in Grafton such as we are. Just a great gathering of folk. And I hope you all have a wonderful Christmas. And thank you again for being here. It's just marvelous. And we'll look forward, hopefully, to meeting again next year. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bill. You want to go ahead and turn on your camera and wave goodnight to Bill? Thank him.
Yeah, bye.
Wonderful
Bye,
story.
everybody. Take care.
You're here in the village.